you are visiting with us, my name is Brad, and I'm one of the pastors here at Summit. And we started a new series called Know Thyself a few weeks ago. And if you were to ask me and say, well, why are we doing this series? Like, what's the heart behind it? What's the motivation behind it? It's a pretty simple answer for me. And I really believe, and this is, by the way, also very personal, but I really believe that with all the busyness of our lives, and with all of the technology that exists today and all the information, all the media, all the things that are being thrown at us, I really believe that we have forgotten who we are as people. And this is evidenced in the reality that today, probably more than any other time in history, people are significantly questioning, like, why are they here? Why am I on the planet? Why do I exist? What's the purpose of my life? That's a question that is a really big question for a lot of people today. And some are asking on a large level, and some are just, it's a kind of a nagging question that lingers in the back of their mind. But it is a question that is plaguing our society today. And it's a question that exists inside and outside of the church. We have a deep sense of not knowing who we really are. We have lost our sense of identity. We struggle with who we are. And I believe the interesting thing about this is that Christianity actually has a gift to give us in this struggle, and that is the resolution of this crisis. That in the middle of you and I wrestling for, like, why am I here and what am I doing and who am I really? There is an answer that is given to us in the Jesus movement. In fact, when you join the Jesus movement, when you say, I'm going to be a part of this, I'm going to follow Jesus and I'm going to believe these things about Jesus, when that happens, there are specific things that occur that address the issue of your identity, of why you are on this planet, of where you will find your value, of who you are, no matter what circumstance you find yourself in. There are things in the message of Jesus, there are truths in Christianity that fundamentally shift our understanding of identity. And so our hope is that we would consistently and confidently become the kind of people that we can actually become when we lean into these truths. And one of the more interesting observations that we've been making in this series is that this new identity that's delivered, this identity that's to be understood, comes in the form of titles and names, descriptions that we read about in the New Testament. That as the church was first emerging, there were new names given to people. There were new titles and new monikers, if you will, that said, this is who these people are. This is how they're to be known. This is what they're really all about. And they were so distinct. The early Christians were so distinct from their culture and from others that these names were the only way they could really be understood by others, but then they became the ways they understood themselves. And so our hope in this series is to dig into these names, to dig into these words, to look at these titles and say, what does this mean for us today? Like, what does this mean? If I were to take this word and place it on myself, what are the implications of that on my life? And what happens if I really start to allow this to shape who I am? That's what we've been doing. So we've been looking at a variety of terms like follower of the way. Last week, Seth talked about being heirs, being children, sons, daughters of God. What does that look like? What does that mean that terminology is used? What's the purpose of that? How does that fundamentally shift our understanding of ourselves? But today I want to dive into another word. I want to dive into the word believer. Have you ever heard somebody call another Christian a believer? Anybody ever heard that? Raise your hand if you say. It's always a weird thing to me. Like, I've heard people say to me, like, they'll ask me, so is that person a believer? I'm like, a believer in what? Santa Claus? Like, I don't know. It's like this weird, vague term we use, right? Oh, they're a believer. What does that mean to be a believer? It's kind of an interesting term because it could mean any number of things in our culture today. What does it mean to be a believer? What does that mean about our identity? What does that change inside of us? Something really interesting about this particular word. We're looking at all of these words. This one, for some reason, stands out to me in a very distinct way. Because as you understand it, there's more than just a revelation or a realization as we move forward this morning. It's going to be more than just you saying, oh, I never saw myself that way before. As we go into this today, there are implications of this. When you understand what it means, there are things about this that are literally going to change the way you do every single day. Because this word, believer, actually tells us something about how we're wired. It tells us something about how we're made. Yes, there's a theological component to this, but there's also a practical component. There's something about the way it's describing something that meets us in the very realness of our lives. And so when you combine the theology of what it means to be a believer and the practical nature of the idea of believing and what believing results in, when you combine those things, it can't help but change you. In fact, tomorrow morning, I'm just kind of a promise I'll throw out. You can get your money back if you want. But tomorrow morning, if you understand the theological and practical nature of this, I guarantee there'll be a moment tomorrow in which you will see yourself live, think, or do something differently because of your new understanding of this word believer. So we see it several times. We see it in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 4, Acts chapter 10, I think Acts chapter 19. We see it in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Lots of other different places we see a group like this referred to as the believers, those that believe. There's this term believing. Now, there's a basic understanding of this that I just want to get out of the way so that we can all sort of be on the same level playing field. But basically what we're talking about when we use the word believer is this idea that we have a conviction about certain things being true. That's what it means to believe. Like, we believe these things are true. There's a conviction in our hearts. Like, this is a truth. This is sustaining and lasting. It's real. You can lean on it. There's a sense of certain things being true. And in the context of Christianity, being a believer means that those convictions that we have about things being true are convictions we have about Jesus. So being a believer means I have convictions about who Jesus is. Being a believer means I believe things about Jesus. That makes sense, right? Can we all agree on this? All right. You guys are way more on board than anyone else today. I think it's because you're smarter, not because you're more awake. But what this means, this belief that we have, it's based on things we've heard, things that we've seen, right? We've taken this information and we've held it and we go, okay, now I believe these things. The place that those beliefs are held is right here. It's in our craniums. It's in our minds. It's the space between our ears. That's where we hold these truths, right? So I believe these things, but where are those beliefs held? They're held right here in this place. And this is where this word gets incredibly fascinating. We could all agree then that belief has to do with thinking, right? Belief has to do with the mind, right? It has to do with the mind. This means, when we start to understand this, that the Jesus movement, that the Jesus way, it understood human physiology in a way that was far ahead of its time. And let me just explain this. I want to talk about the mind for a few minutes. There's this phrase that gets thrown out today. You hear people talk about brain chemistries. Anybody heard people talk about brain chemistry these days? Raise your hand up if that's you, right? Now, let's think about those two things. Brain and then chemistry. Chemistry for me brings up one memory, and that's high school, right? So chemistry, I loved chemistry in high school. I didn't like all the memorizing and all the formulas and charts. I loved the lab, right? I loved where we put on protective clothing. Anytime you get to put on protective clothing in school, it means we're about to do something dangerous. So I loved chemistry, right? Because you go into this lab and there's beakers and Bunsen burners and protective eye gear and tables and lots of warning signs and eye wash things. Remember the first time you ever saw an eye wash thing? You mean something could happen in here where I have to have water shoot into my eyes? What are we about to do in this place, right? But you go in this place and you learn that all of these different chemicals combine together, react, and they form new things. And if you were like me, you discovered they formed some things your teacher didn't want them to form, right? But there's this idea of activity, right? Of reaction, of things changing, of combustion, of this joining of things. There was movement and activity. Now think about beakers and Bunsen burners and lab coats and your brain. When we say brain chemistry, which, by the way, everyone in this room, we agree that brain chemistry is a real thing. There is a chemistry to your brain. But when you say that, what you are affirming is that this thing that exists inside of our heads, at the top of our necks, this thing, there's movement, that there is shifting, that things are happening, that there's chemistry taking place, that some things are volatile, that some things are interacting with each other, that there's something going on, right? This is not a static environment. When we talk about brain chemistry, what we're saying is that this thing is less of a brick, although for some people it's more of a brick, but for most of us, it's less of a brick and it's more of a laboratory. Brain chemistry means this is a laboratory. That means things are changing, things are moving. We can actually affect things in here. It's a lab of sorts. Maybe you've heard people talk about neuroplasticity. Anybody seen the commercials with the products that promise to increase your neuroplasticity? Which is a beautiful thing, right? I didn't know my neuro needed plasticity, but now I do, right? I always imagine like you order this stuff online, you get it in your house, your friends come over like, what are you doing? I'm working on my neuroplasticity. Can't you tell? You stare at each other. See? Right now I'm working on it. Neuroplasticity means your brain is stretching, it's changing, right? It's this whole idea that as you move through life, you continue to let your neurology grow. So again, this idea from chemistry to neuroplasticity, it means that your brain is changing. You have a changing environment. I remember years ago, we were sitting in the car. I think we were up at 29th and Perry, just down the street. I had my girls in the back seat. They're in the back of the car. And I was driving, and the topic of cell phones came up. And I went on like a typical dad, weird sort of infomercial moment that I don't even think they remember, because I remember hearing them yawn in the back seat. But I started talking about cell phones. They brought up cell phones. And I said, guys, we have no idea. We have no idea at this point in our history how this technology, how the media, the way things are working, the firing of images, we have no idea how all of the stuff that we're carrying with us is going to impact our neurology. I said, it could be, and I think this is when they tuned me out, it could be that 10 years from now, we look back, 20 years from now, and we realize that we have changed the neural pathways of human beings through technology. A couple of months ago, I read an article about parents that are executives in Silicon Valley. The article was about how those parents don't allow their children to use devices like iPads and cell phones because they know what it does to our neurology. They'll force it on the masses, but not for my kids. Why though? Because it's changing the way that we think. It's changing our minds. So all of these things are pointing to this idea of the shifting nature of our neurology. If you heard people talk about mental health, what does that mean? We talk about mental health. Does that mean that your brain can be unhealthy? It does. Are you the one to diagnose that? Probably not. Because, if you're mentally unhealthy, you probably can't. Some of you will get that on the way home, kind of put those dots together. But can your brain get sick? Can your brain be ill? Can it be out of shape? Can it get lazy? Absolutely it can, right? The answer is yes. So all of this has massive implication on our understanding of this word believer. Because remember, where is belief held? In this shapeable, moldable, influenceable, if I can make that word up, place. It's this place where ideas can be shaped and shape the neurology of our own brains. That's where we believe these truths. That's where we hold these truths. We hold truths in a place that is flexible and not fixed. Which means that what we believe has the ability to change our neurology. If we change our neurology, we change the way that we think. And if we change the way we think, we actually change the way we behave. That's one of the things that makes us human. One of the things that makes us distinctly human is we have a private inner life. We can think things. And then we can make a decision whether or not to act on those things or not. And so our thinking can be turned into action. So people in general, all people, we have these ideas, these ideas that we hold, these presuppositions, these paradigms, these worldviews. And through these paradigms, they're like a lens in which we view the world. This is how the world operates. This is how it functions. This is how things go. This is why I'm here. This is why you're here. This is why things don't go the way I want. This is why things do go the way I want. We have all these ideas about how the world is going to work. And those ideas are in this flexible place, shaping the way that we're living our lives. How you think shapes who you are. What you think about. What you allow into this space influences who you are. By the way, we are not the first people to know this. If you dig into this ancient book of wisdom called the Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7 says, "For as a man thinks in his heart, so he is." Some reason all the way back then, people had this sense of the way that we think has an influence on who we are. The way you think is connected to who you are. So what are you thinking about? to understand that what we think about when we talk about this, we're talking about identity formation. How is your identity being formed? Whatever you're thinking about is forming your identity. It's shaping who you are. So I think we can all agree at this point, our minds matter, don't they? They probably matter way more than we've considered until this moment. Some of us are like, I kind of messed up for like 40 or 50 years. Didn't pay enough attention to the mind, right? But let me just shift our understanding of believing for a moment. Because when we say believe in our culture, we say believing, typically that's related to some sort of static truth, right? It's like knowing, it's like an idea, it's like something that we study on a test, we kind of regurgitate it. So we talk about believing and we go, well, believing certain things about Jesus, it's like a bullet list of certain truths, like realities that we kind of hold on to. But when you think about what we've just talked about already, if you have a New Testament, neurologically informed perspective of believing, then you understand when we say a believer, we're not talking about somebody who holds to truths. We're talking about somebody who holds truths in such a way that they shape the operating system of their life. That the way they move through the world, the way they see the world, the way they act with other people, all of those things are shaped by the beliefs that they're holding. So believing at this level is more of an operating system than it is a list of truths that we give assent to. Oh, I agree with this. So when the early Jesus followers were called believers, what people were saying was they've been rewired. They think differently. They act differently because there's something going on. They're holding truths in here that are now affecting the way that they're living. And so this believing becomes an operating system that is contradictory to the world. It is different. It's opposite of. It's changed. It's distinct. But believing means that we are now holding on to new truths in a way that allows them to reshape our old operating system. It reforms our thinking. And then the living that comes out of that becomes distinct. So Christianity, I love this. Christianity, I say this all the time, but it does not invite us to check our brains at the door. If anything, Christianity recognizes and affirms the importance of our intellect, right? Saying we have to think about these things. It understands the importance of the mind. Believers hold truths that are different, but not for the sake of argument. Why do we hold these truths? We hold them for the sake of transformation. I love this. There's this one moment where the Apostle Paul, he's writing to the church that's forming in Rome. And I really, when I think about the church in Rome, I think it's probably a lot like us in some ways, that it was just this cross-section of people from every walk of life, and they were beginning to join this Jesus way. And so Paul writes a letter, and he's trying to instruct them, like, here's what it looks like to begin to live this out and engage this in a meaningful way. But then there's this really, really interesting part about our neurology in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. And I want you to listen to what he explains to this group of people. He says this. He says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of what? Your mind. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't say be transformed by hitting up the gym and doing squats. He says be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove what is the good and acceptable, perfect will of God, that you might actually exhibit this. So don't be conformed, but be transformed. Literally, the word is metamorphosis. The same word. It's this total transformation. Don't just be conformed. Don't just be herded like everybody else in culture. Don't just follow this pattern that's already there. Be transformed. Experience a metamorphosis that allows you to then exhibit the truth of God in a way so that people can see it. It's a transformation through the renewal of your mind. Now, the interesting conclusion that you can draw, for good or bad, out of what Paul's saying is this. Wherever you are right now is the result of how you think. Where you are right now is the result of what you believe. In large part, the things that you wrestle with, the things that you're dealing with, where we are in this cultural moment as a society has to do with what we think about. We have come from our thoughts. In fact, Francis Schaeffer, he said this, I love this quote. He says, there is a flow to history and culture, and this flow is rooted and has its wellspring in the thoughts of people. That quote is taken from a book he wrote in the 70s called How Shall We Then Live? And Francis Schaeffer was essentially saying that where we are in our modern day culture today is the byproduct of all of the various philosophies that have been developed by humanity, layered upon one another to where we get to today. In other words, where we are today is the result of how we think as human beings. So could it be that this identity crisis that we can see happening is the result of us just giving lip service to beliefs instead of allowing those truths to change how we operate in the world? Could it be that this sort of apparent contradiction that we experience, where there's a life that Jesus has promised, a fullness and a hope and a joy and peace, all these things, could it be that the contradiction between that promise and what we're actually experiencing is that our operating system has not been fundamentally changed? We haven't allowed our beliefs to change how we really are thinking about the world. We believe in Jesus like we believe in Abraham Lincoln. It's just sort of there. It's undeniable. It's a fact I hold to. But how does it change the way you're living? Could it be that rather than letting Jesus reshape our thinking, we've allowed our thinking to reshape Jesus? So think about the operating system of our world. What are we left with? Our culture gives us just a handful of things. This is really obvious when you think about it. It gives us material goods, materialism. It gives us romance. Our culture gives us money. Our culture gives us success. Our culture gives us hedonism, pleasure. Our culture gives us the approval of other people. Basically, that's the operating system of the world. You want to make life meaningful. You want to make life work. Well, just start moving through those things, right? Just gather some stuff and have some romance and get some money and get a couple wins under your belt and try to make people around you happy and just keep that cycle going. Keep that thing happening. Just keep doing that. That's the operating system of our world, which, by the way, we let that manipulate our understanding of Jesus. We think Jesus is here to help us have a few more wins, get a little bit more money, experience a little romance. But when will we realize? When we realize that the materialism, it's never going to be enough. In fact, materialism in itself, this is just an interesting side note. I'll digress for just a moment. Materialism, what we call materialism is really materialistic in our culture. Materialism is a philosophy. It was developed in the 1500s. René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, those are the two prominent philosophers that promoted this idea of materialism. True materialism as a philosophy, as a way of thought, basically undermined any sense of the spiritual, any sense of there being anything unseen, and it said that life is ultimately about what is physical and can be seen. The only thing that matters is matter. By the way, Karl Marx was a materialist in this sense. So materialism basically became the way people thought, hey, we need to throw out the unseen. Let's just live focused on what is happening. It's just matter interacting with matter. And so the ship sailed, and human philosophy became defined by these underpinnings, that anything that's going on in life, understanding humanity, it just has to do with the physical that's all around us. The only thing that matters is the physical. And so when we look at where we are today as a culture, sort of the outcome, the symptom of this thinking is that we get obsessed with stuff. Because for centuries, human beings have been saying it's the stuff that matters. The only problem is, a couple decades ago, scientists began to see a whole lot more than just the matter, right? This is what's fascinating. This philosophy is the defining philosophy of our age, and yet science these days has proven that all of the matter of the universe fits inside of a teaspoon. And that actually what's all around us is energy. But is anybody going back and correcting René Descartes or Thomas Hobbes and saying, wait a second, you guys got it wrong? No. Why? Because materialism has become the framework, the worldview through which we see the world. So the same is true with romance. I mean, when is love, we're going to realize it's not all that we really need, right? We keep watching the movies, reading the blogs, getting the books, dreaming about the poems being written to us, the flowers being delivered. At some point, you realize this whole romantic dream that keeps putting in front of us, it never measures up. When do we realize that the money, no matter how much money we get, it's never going to be enough money? We had an attorney friend in New York that one time said to me, he said, Bradley, money doesn't make the world go round, but it sure does grease the gears. And he's right in some ways, right? But when will we realize it doesn't matter how much money, it's not going to satisfy? How many stories will we hear of people who are rich and famous, their lives crumble in front of us, and then we tell ourselves privately, but I would do it differently. That wouldn't happen to me. Well, why? The paradigm is still there. The success, how many of us will go from success to success? All of us have these when moments. We always have these things we hold on to. Well, when I get to here, then we get there and we're like, oh, great. I need another one. And so we just create another when moment. Well, when we get to this, when we get to that, when we get here, when I achieve this, when I have that accolade, well, when is it ever enough? It isn't. Maybe the secret to success is that it doesn't work. It doesn't satisfy us. When do we realize you can't make everybody happy? And you can't make anyone happy all the time. Amen? Those of you that are married, right? You know what I'm talking about? When will you realize like there's no such thing as the perfect relationship? When do we realize these things? See, this is the system that our world gives us. It gives us all of these things and says this is how you're going to find meaning in life. This is the paradigm through which you're going to find some sort of hope or life or peace. And the best evidence that we don't allow Jesus to change it, but we change Jesus to meet those needs, isn't some overt thing we say. None of us in the room go, yeah, I love being materialistic. It's so much fun. No, the evidence, the best way we see that this is our operating system is what happens when we don't get what we want. When the materialism isn't there and the relationship does fall apart and the promotion doesn't happen and there isn't enough money, who do we get angry with? How many times do we get angry with God and we go, man, why is this happening to me? And he's saying, you're just living in a totally different operating system. You haven't let these truths transform your thinking. This is why I love what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 is one of the most profound things that you can find in the New Testament. This is beautiful and applicable, but I want you to listen to this. Verse 3 of 2 Corinthians 10, he says, for though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. So I know we walk in the flesh, but the war we're waging isn't something we wage physically. That's what he's saying. Then in verse 4 he says, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. Now, when you hear something like this, like destroying strongholds, the imagery for a lot of us that pops up is like, you see like cartoony devil with a pitchfork and the tail and the horns and the whole thing. You see like this whole demonic thing. He's talking about strongholds and it's in this demonic spiritual realm and it's another dimension, all these different things until you get to verse 5. And then he elaborates on strongholds and he says, we destroy strongholds. And then in verse 5 he says, we destroy, and what are the strongholds? Arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. And take every, what? Thought captive to obey Christ. So the Apostle Paul says that our job is to battle to destroy strongholds. But the stronghold he's talking about is this sort of mental space that we're discussing today. He's talking about ideas. He's talking about philosophies. He's talking about arguments. He's talking about worldviews. These are strongholds that keep us from moving to the place that we're being invited to move. There's this mental battle, and he's saying you need to destroy the mental battle. You need to win this thing. And then this last phrase, I love this. He says, take every thought captive to obey Christ. Take captive every thought. The Greek word that he's using here, the nuance of it is that you control it and you bend it into submission. I like this. You take it captive, you bend it into submission. You make it obedient. What does this mean? It means that there are going to be times when you're frustrated with the old paradigm and living in it. And you're going to have a moment when you go, man, why isn't my life working the way I want it to work? Why doesn't it follow the stories in the movies? Why doesn't it follow the headlines? How come that person got blessed and I didn't? How come my life doesn't look like that life? We're going to have these moments. And what he's describing is a moment when in the middle of that mess, we wrestle that thing to the ground. And we say, you know what? That is a different paradigm for living, and it's not the paradigm of Jesus, and I'm not going to get wrapped up in that. And we bend those thoughts into submission, and we say, I'm not going down that road. That's what he's describing, breaking those strongholds, changing the way you think, addressing the inconsistencies between what Jesus has promised and what this world has promised. You change your thinking. How do you make your mind? I'm going to give you two things. Two quick things. First of all, don't believe everything you think. This one I'm just kind of preaching to myself today because I tend to think that I'm right a lot. Just ask Sherry. I tend to think I'm right a lot, but just because you think something doesn't make it true, right? Just because you think something doesn't make it true. In fact, the Bible uses dozens of phrases to describe our mind that are not exactly encouraging. I don't know if you realize this, but the Bible in fact, I'll just give you a few. In Deuteronomy, our minds are confused. Job, anxious, closed. Ecclesiastes, evil, restless. Leviticus, rash and deluded. 2 Kings, troubled. 1 Timothy, depraved. Romans, sinful. Corinthians, dull. That's just mean. Now we're just getting mean, right? You're just getting insulting. You're just a dull mind, right? blinded in 2 Corinthians, corrupted in 2 Timothy. These words, really encouraging, by the way, right? But what they're just describing is our own fallibility. Maybe this is why you enter into the Jesus movement by admitting that you're broken. Maybe the reason that we step into this by repenting and saying, I don't have it all together, is because we don't have it all together. And that's the first step towards actually experiencing the life he's promising us. So what are you thinking about? In fact, when you think things, do you ask yourself, why am I thinking this and where does this thought come from? Don't do that too long because you'll drive yourself crazy. But don't believe everything you think. And when you think things, ask yourself the question, why do I think this? Remember, this is a pliable space. This has been shaped and formed, and people have been speaking things, and songs have been singing, and movies have been playing, and all of these things have been happening, and they're telling you a certain thing. So when you think that, do you ask yourself, where's that coming from? Are you taking every thought captive and bending it into submission to what's really true? What's really true about this moment? That's the first thing. Don't believe everything you think. Second thing is, preach the gospel to yourself. The gospel is power and life. The gospel is essentially at its core this story that says that I am so broken that somebody had to die for me, but I'm also so loved that somebody did. When we preach that to ourselves over and over again, it redeems our sense of identity. It changes how we understand ourselves. It changes how we look at the people that are living life around us. It changes our understanding of the world that we're living in. So we need to continually preach the gospel to ourselves. Remind ourselves, we talk all the time at Summit about Lectio Divina, and we have these classes, and we come to church on Sunday, we do all these things. Why? Because all of these things are messages. The songs we sing, they're telling us a story, and it's shaping our mind. It's reminding us of the gospel. So we preach the gospel to ourselves. I have a mentor, he calls this going to the brain gym. He just says, you got to go to the brain gym every day. You just got to remind yourself. Go to the brain gym. Remind yourself of the truth of the gospel. 1 John 4, this is a beautiful example. John says, so we've come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. I love that sentence. Talk about the essence of the gospel. We've come to know and believe the love that God has for us. But do you notice the distinction between knowing and believing? Some of us know the love of God, and we've called it belief. But he's talking about knowing and believing. You know, and then you believe. And believing is when the operating system begins to shift. Believing is when we move from assent to action. Believing is when we say, the love of God that I've heard about and know about, I'm actually going to let that start overriding the other thoughts. I'm going to be transformed by the renewing of my mind. I'm going to take every thought captive. I'm going to break down strongholds with the love of God that is at the center of the gospel. I love this from Brennan Manning. He says, the faith that animates the Christian community, the faith that gives us life, is less a matter of believing in the existence of God than a practical trust in his loving care under whatever pressure. And then he goes on, he says, for I have not said in my heart, God exists, until I have said, I trust you. I have not said in my heart that God exists until I have confronted the old paradigm. I have not said that God exists until I begin to lean into his truths over the truths that my culture has delivered to me. It isn't until I've allowed him to change the operating system that I've said God exists. I say God exists. I believe these things. I become a believer when I let these truths become the overriding truths of my life. I love this. The Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 4. He's writing to the Philippian church, and he's talking at length about all sorts of things about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And he closes and he says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Think about these things. And he goes on in verse 9, he says, what you have learned and what you have received and what you have heard and what you have seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Would you stand with me? May you think about what is pure and lovely and commendable and beautiful and true. May you think differently because of the truths of the gospel, and may the God of peace richly dwell with you. Amen? Amen. Love you guys so much. Thanks for being here today. Next week, we're talking about the temple of the Holy Spirit. Should be interesting. If you want to pray with somebody today, there's folks down front. We'll see you guys next Sunday.